Bueno, yo la voy a reanudar, ya estamos grabando y Connie, tú ya puedes abrir una nueva grabación, ¿o no?
No.
En el
Pausar
teléfono.
Pero tú
grabación,
tienes que
detener
pasar a la
grabación.
sala de español, ¿no?
Estoy en la sala de español y me dice pausar grabación, detener grabación.
Ah, no, pero acá me sale que Adriana puede... Que alguien me está iniciando la... Bueno, ¿empezamos? Ya, Connie, te di permiso para grabar en tu computador.
¿Podemos ingresar la gente a de la sala o? Buenas, buenas a todos. Veo que están llegando. Los que puedan poner sus cámaras, maravilloso. Aquí nos encanta verlos, saber con quiénes estamos. Vamos a dar unos segunditos mientras, uno o dos minuticos mientras va llegando toda la gente. Muy buenas a Camila, Cristina, Venus, María, Marcela, Lakshmi, Carlos, Lida, Pedro. Bienvenidos, qué delicia verlos, estar en este espacio. Juan Alejandro, Luisa, Adriana, Sergio, Elsa, Natalia. Fantástico. Bueno, muy bien. Bueno, todavía siguen entrando otros.
¡Qué rico! Bueno, es mejor así, ¿no? Que nos podemos ir como viendo en la cámara todos los participantes. Seguramente en algún momento nos toca bloquear como los audios y usar mucho el chat, todo lo que se les ocurra por el chat. Bienvenidísimo. Aquí vamos recogiendo preguntas, inquietudes, comentarios a través de ese chat, así es de que úsenlo todo lo que necesiten.
Bueno, muy bien. Siendo las 36, vamos dando inicio a esto, a esta conversación profunda de Efecto Mariposa. Todavía llegan más que se están uniendo. Bueno, muy bien. Entonces, normalmente, nuestros días y en estos tiempos son muy agitados y lo que solemos hacer es respirar profundo antes de arrancar esta conversación. Entonces, para que no estemos afanados, no estemos demasiado en la lista de tareas, no estemos en la intelectualidad exacerbada, sino que podamos soltar y estar presentes, conectarnos con todo eso que está entre la piel y las tripas y el corazón. Entonces, para eso nos vamos a dar un momentico de respirar profundo. Los invito a que cierren los ojos. Si están sentados, suelten las piernas. Se pongan en una postura cómoda. Y suelten todo lo que tienen, todas sus tensiones. Y como con cada exhalación, así de manera espontánea y natural, en el ritmo natural, puedan como botar, soltar todo aquello que han estado procesando, cargando, acumulando durante el día. Y los invito a que hagamos 3 inhalaciones todos juntos. Para eso soltemos el aire. Inhalamos. Y exhalamos. Lo más largo que podamos. Y luego inhalamos cada vez más lento. Y exhalamos. Y inhalamos. Y exhalamos. Todavía con los ojos cerrados. Sientan ese campo colectivo en el que estamos todos juntos. Invisible, a través de la distancia. Pero es un campo de conciencia en el que nos encontramos juntos. Y estando presentes en ese campo, aquí, ahora, nos dispongamos a escuchar, a hacernos esas preguntas profundas. Y a traerlas a esta conversación. Y podemos abrir los ojos. Bueno, muy bien. Para iniciar, voy a dar una pequeña introducción y vamos a leer un poema y luego le voy a pasar la palabra a Aleja y a Nate para esta conversación. Alejita, Alejansola, puedes compartir nuestro poema y arrancamos por ahí? Bueno, muy bien. Lo voy a leer en inglés para conectarnos con esa creación de William Stafford y luego en español para irlo trayendo más a esta conversación hispanoparlante. Muy bien. Being a person. Be a person here. Stand by the river. Invoke the owls. Invoke winter, then spring. Let any season that wants to come here make its own call. After that sounds goes away, wait. A slow bubble rises through the earth and begins to include sky, stars, all space, even the outracing, expanding thought. Come back and hear the little sound again. Suddenly, this dream that you are having matches everyone's dream, and the result is the world. If a different call came, there wouldn't be any world, or you, or the river, or the owls calling. How you stand here is important. how you listen for the next things to happen, how you breathe. William Stafford. Y aquí una traducción libre al español. Ser humano ahora. Sé humano ahora. Párate frente al río. Invoca los búhos. Invoca el invierno y luego a la primavera. Permite que cualquier estación que quiera venir aquí, ahora, haga su propio llamado. Y cuando ese llamado se haya ido, espera. Sentirás que una burbuja se eleva lenta sobre la tierra y empieza a incluir en ella al cielo, a las estrellas, a todo el espacio, incluso al frentero y expansivo pensamiento. Vuelve aquí y escucha de nuevo el llamado. De repente ese llamado, que es solo tuyo, se encuentra con el llamado de cada uno de los seres y el resultado es el mundo. Si el llamado fuera otro, no habría mundo, no estarías tú, ni el río, ni el ulular de los búhos. La manera en la que te paras aquí importa. La manera en la que escuchas aquello que está por llegar. La manera en la que respiras. De William Stafford. Bueno, muy buenas. Bienvenidos a todos. En esta conversación profunda vamos a hablar de las sociedades ecológicas centradas en el alma con Nate Bacon. Nate es un ecologista que trabaja mucho los vínculos entre la naturaleza, de la percepción, el lenguaje, la cosmogonía occidental y la identidad del ser. Es un guía de Animas Institute con el cual hemos creado estas conversaciones y con Efecto Mariposa. Viene trabajando con nosotros desde hace 5 años y actualmente está explorando como esas relaciones mitopoéticas entre la evolución, la conciencia humana y la crisis actual en la que estamos, tanto ecológica como pues de muchos aspectos de nuestra existencia. También es un fermentador, jardinero, pues cultivador jardinero de los bosques, digámoslo así, naturalista, cazador con arco y bueno, y tiene una maestría en filosofía y religión. En las últimas conversaciones hemos estado mirando en las últimas 2 que tuvimos como esa transformación personal y colectiva que necesitamos, abordándolo de una manera profunda y holística, haciéndonos la pregunta de qué es la vida, qué es estar vivo, qué es eso de ser humano en este planeta, de qué se trata este momento. Que son preguntas que tanto en Efecto Mariposa como en Animas venimos trabajando a profundidad, como con esa mirada integradora, tratando de soltar esos paradigmas como mecanicistas, materialistas, reduccionistas que nos han traído hasta ahora. Y justamente conectándonos como un poco con todos los hilos en esa complejidad que es estar vivos ahora, como reconociendo lo misterioso, aquellos hilos externos, pero también internos, y cómo el alma nos está tocando a la puerta de una manera colectiva, pero también individual. Y cómo nuestra cultura, nuestra colectividad, nuestra comunidad pues puede generar ese espacio de transformación y de cambio de manera de ver tanto la vida, la realidad y cómo queremos habitar este mundo. Entonces, le voy a pasar aquí la palabra a Aleja y a Nate. Welcome, Nate. Bienvenida, Aleja. We are very, very pleased to have you here, and I'm very looking forward to hear you both.
Gracias, gracias. Muchas gracias, Adri, y bienvenidos a todos. Qué delicia ver caras conocidas y desconocidas aquí, atentas como a estas conversaciones profundas que se han creado un poco como para ir conectándonos con esos públicos más grandes a los cuales estos temas les vienen como tocando seriamente la puerta y llamando. Entonces, bienvenidos. Hoy, como decía Adriana, vamos a estar con Nate Feicon de Animas Valley Institute abordando eso que es el tema central de nuestra conversación hoy acá. Sociedades ecológicas centradas como en la manifestación del alma de sus individuos. Vamos a estar conversando qué significa eso, porque eso es diferente de lo que estamos viviendo actualmente, cómo podemos trabajar desde lo colectivo y desde lo individual como para conseguir esas sociedades que sean más bien como sociedades nutritivas, que permitan como alcanzar ese bienestar para la manifestación plena del sentido del ser humano en la tierra, en relación y pertenencia con todo aquello que es este hermosísimo lugar que llamamos planeta Tierra. Nate, thank you again for being with us, and permíteme entrar como con esta pregunta fundamental para esta conversación que nos da la información necesaria con la que arrancaremos. Para las personas que quieran escuchar la conversación en español, existe la traducción simultánea, ingresando en la parte de abajo de sus pantallas por ese mundito y conectándose bien a la sala de inglés o a la sala de español. En la sala de inglés van a encontrarse con Denise Ganinsky, que está haciendo esa traducción para que ustedes puedan como más cómodamente entrar en estos temas que no necesariamente son fáciles de nombrar. So, Nate, we are now here invoking all this knowledge that you bring to us and asking you, what is it that you understand by eco-centric societies?
Thank you, Aleja. Thank you, Audrey. And hello, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here with you all. Before I dive into trying to answer some part of that question, it's a really big question. Just want to, I know that this has been addressed at least a little bit, but I want to emphasize that given that we're all, at least I'm very far away from all of you all may be relatively close to each other, but we're all here on a screen together, and it's so nice to have feedback from our bodies and our words together. And given that we can't do that, those of you who are able to have your videos on, I just want to say I totally welcome that. It's great to see your faces and to just feel your presence. Those of you that can't or don't want to, and also those of you that have your video on, please do feel free to use the chat. I'll see. I'll do my best to not only be speaking, but to pay attention to what comes through the chat as well, and have that just inform. It's just great to have feedback, so I'm not just speaking in a vacuum, and to feel like I'm really with you all. So again, thanks for having me, and yeah, my pleasure to be here. What do I mean? What do we mean? What does this conversation mean by eco-soul-centric societies? It's a great question. It's a big question. It's a question that is far beyond my capacity to give any kind of complete answer to. And I want to just acknowledge maybe here at the beginning of this whole conversation, but also at the beginning of this conversation, sorry, at the beginning of this question in particular, that I'm bringing a particular perspective, and one that I hope you all will find valuable. But also, I'm just one person, and this is just one perspective, and I just want to acknowledge the wealth of beautiful imaginings and thinkings that must be present here in this whole group about what a generative kind of world could look like. What would that look like? What could that look like? Both for humans and for the other than human world, for all of life on this planet and beyond, but especially on this planet, given its particular challenges of the moment and the uncertain future about how life will unfold, and also on a smaller scale, how, what the human future holds. And maybe here's one way to come at this question sideways of what is an eco-soul-centric society, is that if we were living in an eco-soul-centric society, we probably wouldn't be talking about it.
Yeah,
we
I
probably
guess
wouldn't be having this conversation. And maybe it's important for me to say also that I'm speaking on a very large scale tonight. I'm not speaking about the kind of micro communities and micro cultures. I'm in the northern United States, and most of you all at least are in Colombia, and I'm speaking primarily to that which we have in common, rather than to that which is different between us. Given that we are all a part of the global world and the global economy that seeks to have a certain kind of view of the human and of the non-human that seems to very clearly be not life-enhancing, to use a phrase of Thomas Berry's. So I'm speaking on the large scale of the culture that we all have in common. So there are, of course, cultures within culturals, layers and layers of what we mean by that. So I'm speaking on a large scale. And I think I really do think that's true. If we were living in something like an eco-soul-centric society or community even, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And that's, I think, a really important thing to reflect on. It's similar to what's been observed a number of times by many people, is that indigenous cultures pretty much the world over don't really seem to have a word for our modern equivalent of the word nature. It's an irrelevant concept for them. Their lives are embedded within it. Their lives are not separate from. They don't need a concept of something that, by very nature of the idea, implies an otherness. So there's a similar kind of thing here. In order to talk about eco-soul-centric societies, we have to somehow be removed from them, which, there might be some silver lining in that, to be able to come into a consciousness in some way. Maybe that's one of the potential gifts of this time, is to come into a kind of collective consciousness of what it might look like to have at least a relatively more globalized cultural field. So lots of layers of culture, but a kind of globalized culture of that is more something like eco and soul-centric, by which I mean something like, and I'm just going to kind of play around with words here because there's no strict definition that I'm working with, but something like something very much like what it might look like or feel like to not need the word nature in our vocabulary, to not even have that concept.
Can you chat a little bit about that exactly? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so just like I was saying a few moments ago, in indigenous cultures across the world, there seems to be a common pattern that there's no equivalent in indigenous languages for what we mean by nature, as in something other than the human sphere, something that you go out into, something that is a kind of it's also a kind of monolithic concept. It's like one big thing that holds a lot of stuff, but all of that stuff is out there. And in the Western world, whether the individuals on this call believe it or not, but the kind of one of the fundamental ideas or kind of undercurrents of belief in the Western world is that all that stuff out there that we call nature is somehow not alive, not alive in the same way, at least that we are, not ensouled, not animate, that it's somehow mechanical or less than. There's all kinds of variations on a theme of different philosophical or religious articulations of the hierarchy here, but somehow humans are somehow different from. But an ecocentric society or culture or community or tribe, at the very least, would be embedded in the natural world, both physically, but even more importantly, psychically, meaning of the psyche, using that word instead of the word psychological, because psychological sometimes, at least in English, comes across as kind of a clinical concept. But I mean of the psyche, like our psyches embedded in the more than human world, in the other than human world, and that our human communities, our human cultures are entwined with, and even that the human communities in some very important ways hold the larger whole of the more than human world. So let me just pause here. More than human world is a phrase from David Abram, beautiful, wonderful man who's also influenced Efecto Mariposa to some degree. It's a phrase of his. It means the wild world, but it includes the human. It's more than human, but it is also the human. A little bit different than the other than human world, which is not including humans, but I'll use them both many times on this call, probably.
Okay.
So to be embedded in the more than human world and psyche, and our psyches are embedded in the more than human world, and to some degree, in some way or another, even hold that larger whole of the more than human world as a higher value, even though we probably wouldn't even talk about it like that. There's, that's a kind of modern economic way to talk about it, but in some way that there's a primacy to the more than human world, to the larger whole, rather than to the strictly human, and especially rather than to an individual human, which is another feature of modern Western cultures, especially is the individualism of I can do whatever I want and I am whoever I want to be, which is a way of removing ourselves from the relationships within which we're embedded, which is, again, one of the hallmarks of Western culture. So that there's a kind of primacy to the larger whole, and the culture itself is designed in some way, consciously and probably unconsciously, like by the collective conscious of the community or the society, designed to be to hold that primacy, to hold the humans in relationship with and participatory, mutually enhancing relationship with the other than human world, so that the more than human world is the greatest value.
That relates a lot about this relationship between you being the participant and you being part of this larger being called Earth. And what do you mean by soul in that sense? Eco, soul centric.
Great, yeah, that's a great next question. Because we could just kind of throw that word soul in there and then just not really address it. kind of sneak past it, but it's a really important word. So in many ways, eco and soul centric, those two, whatever the word is for the first part of a word, they're sort of interchangeable, at least how I think about them. But soul means something a little bit more particular than eco. And if you happen to be on the last one of these public conversations that we had a few weeks ago, you would have gotten a much larger, much deeper, much more detailed version of the definition of soul. But in short here, soul meaning something like the place that any thing in the world, and I don't mean thing in a reductionist sense, I mean thing in the sense that the poet Rilke uses the word, at least as it's translated in English, meaning like all the parts of the world, that everything in the world is a soul or has a soul, meaning not the thing that we sometimes think of as like inspirits us and like the life source that gives us a kind of the spark of life, or various kinds of ways that we sort of think about that in a fuzzy kind of way, without clear definition. So not like that, but rather the place that every individual has in the whole, everything, whether that thing or individual is a human being or a sloth or a moon bear or a lizard or the liver inside of a small squirrel in the jungle, or a particular cell or a rock, or this desk that I'm sitting at. That everything has a place in the world, and everything is what it is by virtue of its relationship with everything else. I'll say that again because that's a phrase that I really like to use. Everything is what it is by virtue of its relationship with everything else. So soul is the place that any thing in the world has. It's the place that anything has in the world, and that place in the world is not geographical, it's relational. It's place of relationship in the large constellation of all things of the world, the whole world. It's my particular place in that web. And maybe just really briefly here to say that it seems to be, and this will be relevant, I think, in this conversation, it seems to be that, I'm going to try to say this very briefly. It seems to be that human beings are the only creatures, at least that we're aware of, that can, to put it as David White has said, that we can refuse our own flowering. Meaning that we can fail to live into like the fullness or the depth or the place of our souls, which sometimes we call our ultimate place. Like we can have a place in the world, but it's not really the place that the world most longs for from us. We're not fulfilling the deepest longing that the whole has for us as a part of its whole. We seem to be the only creatures that don't sort of naturally inhabit their ultimate place in the world, which is to say it doesn't naturally inhabit their, or just instinctually would be a better word than naturally, because we do naturally inhabit it, but we don't instinctively. It doesn't just happen automatically for us to automatically inhabit that ultimate place. It seems to be embedded into the way we're designed to unfold and mature as human beings, that we have to come into consciousness. So it seems to be related to the style of consciousness that humans have been granted by the large whole, which is not to say humans have the only kind of consciousness, but it's that humans have a particular style of consciousness that seems to require us to become conscious. We have a certain kind of conscious self-awareness. We have to become conscious of ourselves in a particular kind of way that is like it's a journey, a process of discovery of our ultimate place in the world.
Eso que estás diciendo, Nate, eso que estás diciendo ahora parecería como que anuncia la necesidad de que haya una especie de desarrollo de lo humano, que tal vez no somos muy conscientes, como que los humanos vamos desarrollando a lo largo de nuestra existencia. Sería bueno como que nos contaras qué es eso que se llama ese desarrollo del desarrollo de lo humano. ¿Qué sería eso como que nosotros entendemos como desarrollarse como humano para poder florecer un poco desde nuestras propias almas? I'm going to ask you in English, what is it? It seems like you were talking about like a development, a human development that is needed to flourishing. And I would like to ask you, what is it that we mean by this human development, and what does it have to do with a large scale cultural transformation?
Yeah, thanks. That's probably the heart of this conversation, at least for what I can bring to this kind of conversation. Yeah, which is to draw that connection between us as individuals and, one of approaching something like 10 billion humans on this earth, which is a massive number.
Yeah.
Far outweighing our carrying capacity on the earth at this point. But being only one person, each of us, what is it that, like, there's a voice, at least in me, that I'm aware of that says something like, what's the point even then? Like, what can I do? Why even try? I'll take the blue pill or whichever pill it was from the Matrix to just go back in, right? Yeah. But to go back more to your point and kind of unpack hopefully a little bit more that feeling that I think probably arises in all of us in some way, has or will, maybe is right now arising in us, that I'm only one of 10 billion people. But more to the point of your question for now, what is human development and what does it have to do with eco-centric societies? So human development is the kind of catchy, bookish term for the process of human unfolding on an individual scale. And so in a very kind of very kind of superficial way, we could just say, like, humans are designed to have a period of infancy, and then we tend to start walking around 1 year of age, and then we have the toddlers and childhood, and some strange thing called adolescence that nobody really knows what's happening there. And then you become an adult when you turn 18, at least in our culture, and then at 21 in the United States, at least, that's a whole nother thing, because then you can buy alcohol. That's different from most other places, and then you're like really an adult, and then you are an adult, and if you're lucky, you get old and you get to retire, and then you die. And hopefully you have someone there next to you, but these days, many people are lucky to have someone there with us when we die. So that's a really superficial idea, just to give you a sense of what I mean. Like, it's the process of human unfolding, but there is so much nuance to this question of human development, and how how we have been shaped by the world, by evolution, to unfold in our most viable, in the most viable generative capacity. Like, how were we really designed to for our lives to unfold and flourish? Probably not in the way that most of our lives have looked, including mine. It's probably not, these probably aren't the context for our greatest flourishing as individuals. And that's the contrast there between living in a society that's probably decidedly not eco-soul centric, meaning not a very mature society, at least from the perspective that I'm trying to bring forth here. Not a very mature society. And gosh, there's so much more to say, but I'll try to get to the second part of your question and give a short answer, and then we can see where it wants to go from there. So what does it have to do with, what does human development have to do with large scale
Cultural transformation.
Yeah, large scale cultures and the possibility of cultural transformation?
Yeah.
Is that here's a pretty simple thing. I think it really is pretty simple, but it's also really profound, and I think we don't really think about it this way. Most people, generally speaking, is that a mature society is made up of mature individuals. An immature society is made up of immature individuals. It's that simple. Primarily, not 100%, but primarily. An immature society is primarily made up of immature individuals. The question here then, probably some of you are already asking it, is what do we mean by mature? What do we mean by maturity or immaturity? And that's, probably at least some of the direction we're going to head here pretty soon, but I want to turn it back over to you, Aleja.
Yeah, exactly. The next question is that exactly. What do you mean by mature society or mature individuals?
Okay, there's so many different ways to talk about this, or things to bring in and speak about. It's hard for me to grab hold of just one or two. Okay, here's one particular layer, would be that a mature society is made up of not just people that that are chronologically adults, meaning people that are over the age of 18 and maybe have a job and are contributing members to the global economic system, and other kinds of things like that typically define a chronological adult. Makes money, pays money, cleans their house or their apartment, these kinds of things. Or even has gotten married and has for all intents and purposes a good life, and maybe they're a good person, and they mean well, and they vote for the best candidates, and they care about people and about the earth, but that's not what, from at least from the perspective of the human development model that I use, that we use at Animas Valley Institute, that's not what we mean by an adult. So we kind of use the distinction of what is a true adult. That's the question, what is a true adult? So in by our definition, an adult is someone who has become conscious of and is beginning to live consciously their soul place into the world, consciously has discovered some at least a significant dimension of their ultimate place in the world, their soul. it is embodying it, is enacting it, is living it forth in the world as a gift for their people, both human and other than human. Which that's so obviously that's a very different definition of adulthood than is common
really.
in our culture. But I want to just add that, and I'm sure we'll hopefully we'll talk about some of this a little bit more, but that's not the only thing that makes a mature society, is to have a whole bunch of people that have gone through what we call this descent to soul, the developmental human developmental process, which is also a kind of psycho-spiritual journey of discovering our place in the world, our soul, and are living it in the world. It's not just that. An eco-soul-centric society would have, so that's an eco-soul-centric version of adulthood. But there is also eco-soul-centric versions of childhood and adolescence and elderhood as well. And so an eco-soul-centric culture is made up of eco-soul-centric people, by which we mean people that are in eco-soul-centric versions of their developmental stage, whatever that is. That's so a culture that's made up primarily of those kind of people. And here's one. Can I say one thing might seem like it's slightly off topic, but I think it's really relevant to this conversation.
Sure.
And this comes from someone whose name you might hear me say multiple times this evening. A man named Paul Shepard, who is drastically under recognized for his beautiful work and writing. He died a couple of decades ago. But he was sort of the grandfather of human ecology. And anyway, one thing that he said in his book that he was writing as he was dying is that humans don't consciously make cultures. We don't consciously make cultures.
Wow.
But what we do is we consciously bring forth elements of culture. And those elements of culture become like a mosaic. Little pieces, like glass tile pieces that you can't see the hole until you step back. Right? And it's the hole we can't do that consciously. Cultures are emergent natural phenomena that we don't have we don't have meta control over. But we do consciously bring forth elements of culture. And so that's one way to try to maybe connect this idea of a culture is a whole that's made up of its parts. It's a dynamic, open system of wholeness, of which the parts are constantly making it. So cultures are also not static things. They're not ever finished. They're never done. They're never complete. There's no such thing as a culture that is what it is. Cultures are always changing. That's always been true for every culture that's ever existed. And so what is required is for culture to constantly be regenerated, to be reimagined, and to be reimagined in relationship with the larger whole, beyond the community in which the community is embedded, which is the more than human world. Which on a global scale, since our culture is primarily global, it's the whole earth now, but also our local places that make up our individual communities. So humans don't consciously make cultures, but we do consciously bring forth elements of culture that shape the whole, that's what constantly is regenerating culture. That's what's constantly making culture, because culture is never finished. And so if a culture has true adults and true elders those are the cultural visionaries that are bringing forth generative dimensions of culture, then you have, by definition, a mature or soul-centric culture or community that's bringing forth what the world most fully wants from that individual, which is to say what the world most fully wants from culture. We might also imagine, you might imagine with me here, that it's not just it's not just an individual human that has a place in the world, its ultimate place. It's everything in the world, and that includes communities, that includes human cultures, the human species. The human species has a soul. It's probably not static. It's probably something like emergent. But we might imagine, like, what is the place of the human in the world, or what is the place of this culture in the world in its most generative sense? And again, we don't consciously make that, but it's a beautiful thing to imagine the possibility.
Yeah. Nate, claro, uno escuchando estas definiciones tuyas de lo que es una sociedad madura, un adulto, un verdadero adulto maduro, y la manera en la cual, pues a partir de esas partes que se van como todas las veces reinventando, regenerando, pues se va construyendo esa sociedad madura en la que se podría entender que existe un lugar o un espacio en el que lo humano y lo más que humano siente ese colchoncito nutritivo a partir del cual como la vida se desarrolle. Pero, ¿qué pasa cuando ese desarrollo individual pleno y deseable no se da, como lo estás mencionando aquí, y por el contrario lo que hacemos es que nos abordamos como cronológicamente, nos llamamos adultos simplemente cuando llegamos a esta edad que ya hemos referido, pero nos comportamos de alguna manera como dentro de esta cosmovisión imperante en la actualidad en Occidente, que tiene mucho que ver con unos temas materialistas, reduccionistas, fragmentados, mecanicistas, en lugares donde no se forma conscientemente a las personas para llegar a una madurez con sentido, y que también pues tenemos esta idea de la separación, ¿no? De que estamos totalmente separados del contexto del resto de la vida, un poco nombrando lo que tú ya estabas diciendo aquí, de que si no fuera separado, no nos sintiéramos separados, ni siquiera existiría la palabra naturaleza independientemente de lo que somos. Parecería como que aquí se forma como un círculo virtuoso en el que el perro se muerde como la cola eternamente. Es decir, que si no hay individuos adultos, la sociedad entera tampoco tiene esa madurez. Dando ese contexto, te pregunto, Nate, could you please talk a little bit about this pathological adolescent society we embody today? What does it mean to live in this kind of societies?
Yeah. Given how bad my Spanish is, I'm not entirely sure what all you just said there. So I don't know how much you already said about what we mean by patho-adolescent society. Given that this is the first time, at least, I'm using the phrase, I should probably say what I mean by it. It's sort of like the inverse of an eco-soul-centric society, and it's an immature society. It's one that's patho, meaning pathological, by which we could probably give many examples or definitions of how or why our larger cultural system is pathological, but just as a foundational point here, we could just say that we're a culture that destroys its own habitat, which is, I think, pretty pathological. We're pretty much the only species that I'm aware of that does that, and also destroys the habitat of many other myriad other beings as well, living beings. So pathological in many ways, but including that primary one. And adolescent society. A society that's made up primarily of people that are not true adults, people that are chronologically what we mean in the contemporary modern world by adults, people that are over 18, and most of whom are contributing members to society, and most of whom are functional members of a pathological society, which doesn't necessarily make us very healthy to be a functional member of society, which unfortunately is a lot of what contemporary, like what modern therapy helps with. A lot of like the medical system and therapeutic psychological system is just primarily oriented to helping us be functional members of society. But if the society in question is a pathological society, then there's something wrong with that. Something askew there. There's something off. Anyway, adolescent is people who are a culture that's made up primarily of adults in the chronological sense, but not in the soul-centric sense, not in the sense of having consciously embodying their souls in the world. And so let me also just bring a couple of different, make a contrast here between about adolescence. So adolescence is usually what we think of, that word we associate with teenage years. But according to the kind of the way that I and we at Animas Valley think about the human development process and the model of human development that we use, that our work is based in, adolescence is not a chronological phase that lasts from roughly 13 to 19 years old, the teenage years. That's not what we mean. But what we mean rather is a psycho-spiritual, like a deeply of the psyche phase of human life that is oriented primarily around the sociocultural dimensions of life. And here's the contrast that I want to make, is that we can have either eco-soul-centric versions of adolescence. We can also have pathological or immature, or what we might call, in contrast to eco-soul-centric, ego-centric adolescence. Meaning, so maybe we should also talk about the word centric. Centric just means like it's related to the word center, and like what is it rooted in? What is the thing rooted in? So an egocentric adolescence would be an adolescence that's rooted in the ego, just trying to help the ego, the I, get ahead in life. Some version of that. There's so many different versions of that and ways we could say it, but where the ego itself is primary, and the ego essentially serves itself. So an adolescence that is egocentric is one that just looks out for itself, but its center of gravity is still in the socio-cultural sphere. Whereas an eco-soul-centric version of adolescence, the center of gravity is still in the socio-cultural sphere. The psychological gravity is still in the socio-cultural sphere, but there's an eco-soul-centric dimension to it. So in adolescence, person does not yet have a consciousness of their soul's place in the world, but they are contributing to the larger whole of society and of the more than human world, in their eco-soul centrism. So their lives and their psyches are still deeply embedded in relationship with the more than human world, even though their psychological center of gravity is still in the socio-cultural sphere, rather than later, it shifts. We can talk about that if you want to, but the larger point I'm trying to make is that an adolescent, patho-adolescent society, most people, we pretty much automatically make it to adolescence, but we just like, sometimes we make up numbers. We don't, obviously nobody would know what the actual percentage is, but we might say something like there, only 15% or only 10% or only 5% sometimes. Some very small percentage of people that are over the age of 18 or 20 are actually true adults in the sense of this way of speaking about it. And so anybody that's probably around age 13 and over is likely to be still in adolescence. And most of the people in the contemporary world are in an egocentric version of adolescence. Whether you're 13 years old or whether you're 40 or 65. And this way of speaking about human development, most people in the world are an egocentric version of adolescence. And so if you have a society or a culture that's primarily made up of people in an egocentric adolescent stage, then what you get is a egocentric adolescent society.
Yeah, yeah.
Or what we might say a patho-adolescent society.
Yeah, yeah. Hilando un poquito más fino en eso que estás diciendo, esa sociedad inmadura, que es como la norma general en nuestro occidente hoy en día, o en esta cultura occidental, pues esa cultura tiene un impacto directo en el devenir de lo humano, y también tiene un impacto fundamental en ese mundo más que humano del que estabas hablando, que hace parte fundamental de la creación colectiva, que es el planeta. Parecería que hemos como relegado ese mundo más que humano como a un cuarto de San Alejo, y que nos dedicamos un poco a mirar simplemente lo humano. So the question would be, what is the relationship between the immature societies that we have already in Occident culture right now and the actual impact of our actions in the metabolic imbalance of the earth? Let's say climate change, acidification of the oceans, loss of the diversity, poison in the air, in the waters, in the soil, and so on. Could you portray some examples of this relationship between our human imbalance and the planetary imbalance?
Some examples of the relationship, like how those are related. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Well, they're symptoms. It's probably the easiest way to say it. But we have these different crises. And sometimes people on this kind of call are more holistic and would look at these various crises and recognize that they're related to each other. But the general way of looking at these various crises is that they're all disparate, that they're all separate somehow. But we all, all of us in our own ways, probably, or at least most people, carry a kind of undercurrent in our beings of recognition that something's not right, and that's probably conscious to different people and to varying degrees. But someone can be in like an extremely pathological or egocentric adolescence and still have some kind of recognition that things aren't right in the world, and we might articulate our reasons for why something is wrong, or for what we even believe is wrong with the world. We might articulate those in very different ways than other people, but there's probably not very many people alive right now that think that things are going great. But I think very, very rarely do we think about, most people at least, think about these larger scale crises as crises of the human you know, something like a spiritual crisis, or if that sounds too woo-woo for you, you know, like a psychological crisis, like a crisis of humans' way of being in the world, which and even when that happens, it's much rarer for us to consider those crises, all of these crises, to be related to the human development process. It's almost always like, what is it that we can do differently? Usually on a large scale, but it, you know, sometimes we acknowledge that it takes actual individual people to try to help make these changes. Like, but we usually think about them as technological changes or policy changes. We have to vote the right people into office. We have to get the right legislation and policies and technology together to change the thing. And I'm not saying that that's not true, that that's not important, and that we shouldn't be doing those things. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that those things aren't the problem. Those things are not at the heart of what's really going on in the world. It's not a matter of technology. It's not a matter of policy. It's a matter of who we are and how we understand ourselves in relationship to everything else. It's about how we understand ourselves, about how we feel, about how we perceive ourselves in relationship to the world that we're destroying. Take us back to that phrase that I used earlier, that we're the only species that destroys its habitat. That's insane. Literally, that's insanity. But we're all participating. And that's hard to swallow. Everyone on this call, beautiful people as you all are, and as we all are, we're all participating in that. We're all embedded in a context of pathos, because we're all a part of a pathological society. But all of these various crises that are all, each of them enormous and important and deserving of all of our attention. So we can't possibly give all of our attention to each of them, even though they're all deserving. But they're all not really so different. They're all symptoms of a failure of the primary failure of our culture, which is the primary failure of our culture is not climate change. It's not any of the other crises. The primary failure of our culture is in its failure to engender the full flowering of its members, of its human members. And to some degree or another, people with power recognize that, or have over the years. I mean, it's why when Europeans came to the Americas, it's why they would steal the children away and force them to go to the Christian schools and not let them learn their indigenous language. They knew they had to cut the culture off at the roots to stop the process of creating the members of that culture that make that culture what it is. If you cut it off at the roots, which is to say at the base of the developmental process, if you steal the children away, you destroy the culture. That's why that's like at the heart of like the primary way we think of colonialism, and it happens in various ways still, but that's why. We all know this intuitively, even though we don't really think about it very often. We all know it's true. If you want to destroy a culture, you destroy the process of making real people. And so that's the real crisis, is that we have a culture that doesn't know how to make real people, and even suppresses that process, actively suppresses it. The global economy would much rather you keep your attention hooked on talking about all those other crises on Twitter or other social media, because they still got your attention, our attention, my attention. They want our attention. They want us to not give our attention to those other things. Yeah, so they're all symptoms of a much broader, larger, deeper crisis.
Eso nos lleva un poco como a ese desaliento, en muchos casos esa depresión colectiva en la que muchos de los humanos actualmente nos encontramos, ¿no? Sentir como que no hay una manera de deshacer esos círculos en los cuales habitamos culturas que no nutren, sino que al revés van muy en contravía del flujo mismo de la vida. Es como sentirse además como en un panorama mundial, en manos de un liderazgo de personas y de instituciones que parecerían no estar como capacitadas justamente para reaccionar frente a ese tipo de problemáticas que hemos creado y que parecen ser demasiado grandes para un solo individuo. Y la pregunta aquí sería, how to be in the world nowadays? How can we make a difference when we are so small as individuals? How can we have hope and find meaning even amidst all the destruction and suffering we are seeing nowadays?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me just first of all say that I don't pretend to know all the answers to that question. I'm sure there are many, many, many layers of beautiful, right-on answers to that question. So, but I, for the purposes of this conversation, to just emphasize the ecocentric human development process. So I want to also just say very clearly, that's nothing that I'm about to say is meant to say that you shouldn't also engage in other kinds of activism, or cultural change in very practical kinds of ways. Those of you that are familiar with Joanna Macy's work might be familiar with her 3 levels of I forget how she calls it, but something like cultural change activism.
The great turning point.
Yeah, the 3 kind of layers or ways or styles of contributing to the great turning.
Yeah.
The first of which is direct action. So kind of direct action activism, stopping the pipeline, things like that. The second is systems change. So people that are actively working toward changing policies and legislation and institutions and organizations, and so systems change. And then the third one is something like the psychospiritual, like the worldview change, shifting our worldviews. People that are shifting how we understand, how we perceive, how we imagine ourselves and the world. That are imagining a different kind of world. And so she does not explicitly have the human development process in there, but it's somewhere like the 3rd or maybe a new 4th one. We've had conversations. Bill Plotkin was even trying to write a paper about this recently, and I'm not sure if he ever did anything with it, but about whether or not the journey of soul initiation, which is what we call that process of descent journey of becoming conscious of our soul and beginning to embody it in the world, about whether that should be a fourth layer or not. But that's the one I want to emphasize. So, but just to be clear, like all of those are necessary and important for the great turning. But that last one is the one, the psycho-spiritual for Joanna Macy, which is a larger version, but I'm going to emphasize the human development dimension, is the, that's the one that we tend to not think about as much or overlook, and you know, probably think in some way that doesn't actually do anything, or that it's more irrelevant, like it doesn't actually affect change. But I would just greatly disagree with that. Hopefully my reasons for that are clear based on what I've said over the last hour. But how does the, yeah, how do we live? I think this, the poem is a beautiful way to speak about that. The poem that was read earlier, and it's a poem that I love, and that was the first time I got to hear your all's translation of it. So that's a poem
it's a great version, of course.
it's a poem that I've been reading with Efecto Mariposa for many years now, and one of my very favorite poems. But it's that, you know, coming to the end of that poem, that how you stand here is important. That's not something that we tend to think about. How we be here, how you stand here is important. How you listen for the next things to happen. How you breathe. And then there's that line in the stanza before that about suddenly this dream you're having matches everyone else's dream, and the result is the world. That's William Stafford right there, is saying that we all participate in making the world. There's no such thing as not being engaged in a world making process. We are all world makers. We are all engaged in the process of making the world. The world is what it is because of the way that everything in the world makes the world. The world is not a static thing. It's just like I was saying about cultures earlier. The world, the earth, the universe, our cultures, the land we live on, nothing is static. Each of us as individuals, we're not static, finished, complete things. We are in process. The world was not created, 6,000 or even 14 billion years ago or whatever. The world is always being created. Always and everywhere, all the time, being created. It's being created by the world itself, by all of the parts of the whole, making the whole what it is. But it's not a static thing. It's an ever unfolding process. I am not who I was an hour and 21 minutes ago when I got on this call.
Yeah.
I'm a different person. I'm also kind of the same person in some really important and mysterious and beautiful ways, but I'm also different. I'm a different being. I'm made up of a different set of molecules. My relationship with all of the parts of the whole, from the micro to the macro, has shifted in some way. Not that I'm aware of all of the ways that it's shifted, or even most of them, or even very many. But if we look at all the details of all the relationships, at all of the levels of life, from the micro to the macro, I am fundamentally different than I was before. But I'm still embedded in the world. I'm still a part of the world, but I'm everything and everything I do and everything I think and everything I breathe and everything I bring forth in the world, also everything I bring forth into my body. This is all a part of how we make the world. How we stand here is important. It changes us. How we breathe changes us. If we allow if we make ourselves available to being changed by the world, how we listen for the next things to happen can change us, can change the world. It's the whole idea of Efecto Mariposa. It's the ripple effect. That's at the center, it's at the heart of chaos theory. One small change can exact large-scale changes down the road. And it happens all the time, everywhere, without us seeing it, in natural systems, but also in our own lives. Also in our own lives. There's a reason that each of us is sitting here on this call. And I'm not saying it's divine intervention. What I'm saying is that it's the result of all of the ways that you decided to breathe, of all of the ways that you decided to stand here now. Some of which have been beautiful, generative, life-affirming, some of which have not. That's true for me also. That's what every moment is. It's the sum of the infinite unfoldings of all things in relationship with everything else. And this moment right here, right now, is a moment that will never, ever happen again. And every moment is like that. And every moment we have a choice for how we will stand here, how we will listen for the next things to happen, how we will breathe. And it matters. As William Stafford says, it's important.
Yeah.
It makes the world. And in the
Yeah,
context of
we
this conversation,
tend to see
it
that
makes
very,
culture.
yeah, we tend to see that in a very small scale. It's like we are used to think like this kind of approach is so small, so tiny that it's not going to impact the whole body of knowledge or attitudes or way of seeing. And you were reminding us here this ripple effect of the butterfly effect. And in that sense, could you explain a little bit how these ripples can touch from this tiny place, this broader an ample space where we all live called planet Earth?
Yeah. So I can try at least. I mean, that's a, it's a hard question, but here's something that's worth emphasizing is that we, just like humans don't consciously make cultures, we can't just, all of a sudden decide to be eco-soul centric, or to, all of a sudden decide to become conscious of our soul life and embody it in the world fully and completely. Again, this is a process. This is the unfolding of a human life, and it's a long, slow, beautiful journey. This kind of unfolding, and even in particular what we call the descent to soul, that journey of becoming, discovering and becoming conscious, which requires a kind of dying process. We tend to talk about it as a descent process. Of course, there is an ascent on the other side, but that descent it's equivalent to the dying of who we thought we were in the world, of how we've understood ourselves, of how we've understood the world, of who we thought we were, of our role, our roles that we've played in the world, of the life that we've inhabited, the roles and relationships we've inhabited. There's a dying process of all of that. The ascent process, the down here part that's when the encounter happens. That's the what we call the wandering around and the mysteries of nature and psyche. That's where the encounter with we call it soul encounter. It's like being granted a kind of glimpse of into our consciousness of our place in the world, and it usually comes through symbol or myth or image. Not myth in a large scale sense, but like a personal myth. Anyway, that's where we encounter soul. But what I wanted to talk about was this: the ascent is the reshaping of the ego. So there's a dying and a rebirth process, a reshaping of the ego, no longer in service to itself, egocentric, and pre-soul, the ego being in service to, centered in the socio-cultural sphere. That shifts in that journey of soul initiation, that descent to soul, and the ego is reshaped, and then it becomes, its life from then on is in service to soul, or which is to say, in service to the earth, to the world, to the universe of which it's a part. But it's a particular and unique way, because our souls, our place in the world is unique to all of us. But the ego is reshaped. And so we become something fundamentally different. And so this, this process, as I was trying to emphasize at the beginning of what I was saying, is that it's slow. That's, the descent to soul is at minimum, it's a many months long process, because it's a developmental stage of life that most people don't get to these days, but that we're all eligible for and entitled to. And we can't just decide to do that either. We can't just decide. Mystery decides. And so it's I would say it's, something like the kind of aggregation of all of these little moments of being a person here. How I stand here, how I listen for the next things to happen, how I breathe, which is to say, how can I make myself available to the world, to be changed by the world, like to be willing to let go of the small making perceptions and beliefs I have about who I am, about who I can be, but also about the world, the earth, the magical mysteries of the earth, to let go, to release our attachment to the small making beliefs and perceptions about what we think the world is, and make ourselves available, open to the mysteries that are inherent in our lives and the world, and in every given moment. As I was speaking about a few minutes ago, just there is no moment like this one. There will never be this moment ever again, and each of us is constantly changing, and we don't have control over that, but we can participate with that in relationship with everything else. It's that old free will versus whatever, like God's will, or however the other side of that is phrased, determined, that our lives are completely determined. That's such a erroneous argument, because we neither have complete free will nor are our lives completely determined. It's a paradoxical third, where we're in relationship with everything else, but we are active participants in relationship with everything else. That's what makes the world the world. And so each of those moments that we have, that they're all precious. And we can open up to the preciousness of every moment and ask ourselves, like, what, as Mary Oliver did, like, what will you make of your one wild and precious life? Like, every moment is an opportunity to ask that question, or to live some kind of openness to, like, an encounter with the beautiful mysteries of the world, even if those mysteries are mundane, even if those mysteries come forth in just the the amazing experience of cutting up lettuce for a salad. Like that salad grew out of soil that was and photosynthesized light to make energy from the by way of the sun, and it's now feeding us so we can be alive. Like, how amazing is that? It's a phenomenal. We can't even explain it really. We can talk about the scientific process about it, but just the fact that we're here at all, that we exist at all, that lettuce exists at all, it's amazing. We have the opportunity to live in a world of mystery and wonder every moment. And the more we make ourselves available to that kind of experience, the more we can be impacted by the world, the more we can feel the way that the world, the larger whole, longs for us to come closer and closer to that place in the world that it most fully longs for us to inhabit. So one way we could talk about this, it's like the closer we get to that place of where our own longing meets the longing of the world. So we follow our own longing. Joseph Campbell said, "Follow your bliss." That was like his one-liner for like his ultimate, like if he was going to distill all of his work down into one line, it was follow your bliss. That's what he told his students. Follow your bliss, follow your longing. That place where our deepest longing, not just like, you know, I long for a better job or something like that, but our deepest longing, like what we most deeply, fully long for. That is the equivalent of the world's longing. Like the world longs for us to have the most deeply fulfilling, meaningful, mysterious, precious life. It longs for us to that because that's also what makes the world thrive. That's like, that is our way of participating in the regeneration of a viable cultural context, which is to say, a life-enhancing, generative human presence on the earth. That's where we find our deepest, mysterious, you know, most meaningful fulfillment in the world. It's not, you know, how much money we make or how good is our job or, you know, the relationships that we inhabit. These, you know, in some ways might be elements of that, but it's more like, how do we inhabit those relationships? How do we inhabit those places in our world? And sometimes those relationships and those roles, they grow too small for us if we follow our longing. Sometimes, I would say more than sometimes, that's what that dying phase is about in the descent to soul. They grow too small for us, and we have to be willing to let them go. We have to be willing to say yes to that kind of change. Anyway, I could just keep blabbing and going on and on, walking around in circles, chasing my own tail, but I'll pass it back over to you.
No, it's very important to listen to you. You know, when you're talking about these things, you are giving us like this dimension of what it means to participate in the world, and how from these very small things, as you mentioned, just cultivating lettuce for your salad becomes a very magic and sacred moment, and this connection with this mystery of the life, which is so beautiful. In listening to you talking about this, it would be really nice probably to have some examples of what you can do in that daily life to participate and promote these mature cultures that we are really hunger for. So in a way, what kind of things and where to put your energy in a most in a way that the impact is really huge and big. What can you say about that?
I would say that saying yes to these deeper parts of ourselves, these deeper possibilities of ourselves, it may, like, it's not self-centered. It's only self-centered to do that if it's coming from an egocentric place. But if we're really following something like our deepest longing in the world, like our deepest longing, if we're kind of like a dog sniffing a trail and like slowly finding our way and sniffing along that unseen trail of something like our deepest longing, like our it's like a process of making ourselves available. It's more so than it is a doing something, right? What we end up doing arises out of, at least in its fullest potential, it arises out of the following of that trail, that thread of making ourselves available to the beautiful mysteries of the world, even if we don't even know what the beautiful mysteries of the world are. Just like here, like that's one step is, not that this is like a 5-step program or something, but one step we might just imagine is just pretend like the world is magical and mysterious. Pretending is an amazing art that we somehow, for some reason, think should be left behind in childhood. But if what we're doing is trying to embed ourselves more fully into relationship with the world, in relationship with everything else, the more than human world, in some kind of magical, mysterious way, what we're doing is we're trying to learn how to tend those relationships. And pretending is what happens before that becomes conscious. So pretending is how we find our way into that space. Before the tending of our relationships becomes conscious, when we're living our soul life, like, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing in the world. And, I may only be able to articulate it and with, poetic, symbolic kind of language, or it may be a certain kind of feeling, my consciousness of my soul. But what comes before that is pretending. So you can start in a really basic way, like pretend, for example, when you walk out of your apartment or your house tomorrow morning, pretend like the leaves can see you.
Like the leaves, you mean the leaves?
Yeah, or the trees, or the clouds, or the birds that are singing. Like maybe they can hear you also. You might not only be able, be able to see the world, but what if the world can see you? What if the other than human world can see you? You might feel yourself not only seeing, but being seen, or listening, but being heard. Just pretend like that's true. Just see what happens. Let it shape your day. You might pretend like the tree is receptive to your praise about how beautiful you find it, or how strange and like what a enormous enigma the tree is, or how impressive you find it, like, or that the sound of the wind blowing through its leaves. What if you pretend that it can receive your praise? That kind of thing, if we really let ourselves do it, it changes us. The point isn't whether or not the tree can literally hear us. That's irrelevant.
Yeah.
The point is our opening into another way of being in the world, another a completely different possibility of how we inhabit the earth in relationship with everything else, where we aren't the center of everything. Where the world is full of autonomous, mysterious others. that are co-creators of the world with us. What happens if we grant them in our consciousness that kind of autonomy and power? If we do that, we will slowly begin to find ourselves living in a different world. We will change and the world will change. Our perception of the world will change and the world itself will change. Maybe we won't solve climate change as an individual over the next few weeks if we kind of do that kind of thing, but we will change. And we can keep following these kinds of threads. You know, there's only so much I can say in the next 10 minutes. There's only so much that I could say, period. But it's in all of us. We all long for something more. For something more meaningful, relevant. Sometimes we're afraid. Sometimes there's the parts of us that want to keep us small and keep us, you know, afraid to have foolish, you know, ideas of who we are or what the world is. We don't want to look silly. We don't want to look like we're woo-woo spiritual people or whatever the particular voice is that you have, that I have, that any one of us has. And when we have all these parts of us that want to keep us small, but you know, listen to the first one of these public talks if you want to dive more into how to work with them, with those parts of ourselves. But my main point is that we all long for that, even if those voices are trying to keep us from it. We all long for something more, something deeper. And it's there, it's available to all of us. That's the point.
Oh.
Even though in a pathological culture, it's fundamentally denied us in so many ways, on so many levels for so long. It's, you know, in some ways it's kind of the point of a patho-adolescent society is to perpetuate its own severance from the mysterious nature of the living, breathing world.
Wow.
But we can bring those connections back together if we're willing, if we have the courage. We all know how to do it. You know, sometimes we need help and ideas and encouragement or inspiration or whatever it is that I or anyone else could offer you. But it's in all of us. It's our birthright as members of the Earth community. We are not separate. We are not visiting guests on this Earth. We are a part of the Earth. It's our birthright to be in dynamic, mysterious relationship with the whole. That is the nature of our human consciousness. That's the gift that we've been given as human beings. Is to be in a conscious participatory relationship with the rest of life. We all know how to do it. It's within all of us, but it requires slow change, slow courage, slow willingness to open up to some other possibilities, even if we don't know what they are, even if we never know what's at the end of that hallway, or what's at the end of that trail that we're sniffing down.
Great. Nate, why don't we open the space for the public to make you some questions? So probably, I don't know if the microphones are open for the people to say, or they can raise their hands, or probably we can use the chat. Let me know how we're gonna work with this. Okay, so here we have this first question is Sergio Sanchez, who's making it. And he says, it seems that that last two paths towards the great turning are focused on the structure, systemic change, and their inner dimension of self, psyche, soul, own world views. Could you give some examples of how could someone, perhaps through the first path, direct action activism, help other people begin being deeply dragged by this ecocentric, pathological, adolescent, and generalized way of being in the world?
Thanks for the question, Sergio. And you've been right here at the top of my screen this whole time, so it's good to receive your question and having seen your face this whole time. I tend to think of that first dimension as disrupting business as usual. So if the larger cultural system wants to continue to perpetuate itself and has all of these different ways that it does that, the direct action activism tries, and it's almost always extremely small scale, because that's the level that we have available to us, relative to the size of the machine, the kind of pathoadolescent cultural machine. But even though they're small scale, there can be direct action activism, and that looks any number of ways. It can be like tree sitting in the redwoods in California to try to keep old growth forests from being cut down, to direct action protests at any number of global economic forums, or it could also be much more small scale direct action activism for trying to keep a wild like a part of the city from being paved over and turned into a larger building complex, or they can also be social layers, social dimensions. They don't just have to be about ecological conservation, but anything that disrupts the flow of business as usual, and hopefully helps thwart or stop some other kind of action from taking place, or that allows time for something else to take the place of whatever it was that was going to be happening before. And how does that help other people? How does that help people getting dragged into? Simply by I don't, in this moment, I don't have a better way to say it than disrupting the business as usual, disrupting the flow, trying to hold on to the vestiges, to the last threads of what hasn't been conquered already by the machine. So we all need those places. We all need those support systems, socio-cultural support systems. We all need all of those things, and the direct action activism does its best to try to make a space for what's still here, or what can be.
Thank you, Nate. Here comes another question from Irene Clavijo. Do animals in captivity fulfill their soul's purpose, place in the world?
Hi, Irene. I saw your question when it came through, and I almost tried to answer it then. It's a good question, and I'm not going to pretend like I know the answer. And that's especially because I don't. This isn't territory of like right or wrong or true or false. I would say that it's at the very least, it's a gray area. I don't even know if it's 100% true that humans are the only species that can refuse their own flowering, which is why I always say, like, it seems like I'm not aware of other ones that do. There may be other kinds of beings with similar enough style of consciousness that they can refuse their own flowering, but I don't recognize that out in the world. And I guess what I would say in direct response to your question is I would tend to think that they're not able, they've lost the ability to have that agency. But I would say that instinctually they do instinctually, but that possibility has been stolen from them. And I would say that that's not just true of animals in captivity, or especially like animals in industrial farms and things like that, that don't even have space to move or anything like that. I'm sure we could all think of other examples, but I would also include in that the precious metals that are in this computer, the plastics, the petroleum, the metals that make up our cars, the wood here in this desk. But I also don't think that humans as tool makers, I think us being tool makers and tool users it's a natural part of our evolution. It's a part of how we participate in relationship with everything else. But I think the style and the degree to which we do that is destructive and pathological and unhealthy. And to be probably kind of overly anthropomorphic about it, I might imagine, for example, this desk, like the tree doesn't mind becoming wood. It might even be a kind of glorious possibility for how its life might unfold. It's still going to decompose and eventually have a similar kind of fate, but the way in which we do that, the style with which we do that, and it's the how. Again, the how we stand here matters. And as E.F. Schumacher said, the scale is important. We have grossly outdone the scale of what's needed to have viable cultures on this earth. And there's something really important there as well, the excess and the lack of gratitude, the lack of receiving the gifts from the others as gifts. That's what is I think that's the real theft of their own agency, their own soul capacity in the world. And I think that's pretty tragic. I think it's kind of at the heart of what's the pathos of our current culture, is our inability to recognize the gifting of the world for our own livelihood and welfare, and how we grossly overtake.
Here comes another question from Venus White. Nate, how you perceive the new technologies like the metaverse in relation with the ecocentric?
Well, first of all, I'm aware that there's probably a wide range of people's relationships to social media and the online sphere of reality that is available for us to inhabit. And I'm sure many of us have work that requires us to be in these parts, and especially these last 2 years. I don't know as much about how it's been in Colombia, but in the United States, there's been so much connection with other people that's happened in these spheres during lockdowns and everything like that. So I won't pretend like there's not valuable dimensions to them, but I think generally speaking, from my perspective, these kinds of technologies let me just maybe bring in a phrase from the cultural and media thinker Marshall McLuhan from middle 20th century. He said, he has this famous phrase, the medium is the message. The medium is the message. It's not the content of what comes through in these different media that is the actual message. That's not what is actually doing the real shaping of things. It's the medium itself. And he wrote that about other forms of technology. That was before the internet even happened. But if we just consider the way that the medium itself shapes our consciousness, and let me remind you, I am here on Zoom with you. So I'm not saying that everything is 100% bad or anything like that, but generally speaking, these kinds of technologies shape our consciousness in a certain way that brings us away from our bodies. They're disembodied. They dislocate us. They take us away from place. They take us away from the other than human world. They take us in very serious ways away from each other, even though they give us access to other people in some ways. They also, for example, enable, to a large degree, they even enable anonymous interactions with, it's what I sometimes call, it's also the land of no context. Like there's no contextualization of any part of our lives in these spheres. So yeah, I would say all in all, these technologies and the people that run them, the corporations that run them, what they want primarily is our attention. Our attention is the primary global commodity in the global economic world, and it will be for the foreseeable future. And I think that addressing our addictions to screen technology, addressing our addictions of where our attention goes, is a culturally subversive act. It can be a very subversive act in relationship to a patho-adolescent society. They want our attention. They literally buy our attention. And they shape our consciousness with the mean. They want our attention so that they can shape our consciousness to keep the global machine running, to say it in a very general, very straightforward kind of way. So for me, the metaverse, to be specific about that, it feels like the next iteration of that. And it's, I am personally not very excited about it, and I don't plan on participating. I'll just put it like that.
Well, here comes another question from Juan Alejandro Velázquez. And he says, can you feel the difference in your body? Can you feel a quantic change? Do your systems emanate different frequencies?
Will you repeat that one, Aleja?
Yeah. Can you feel the difference in your body? Can you feel a quantic change? Do your systems emanate different frequencies? I guess like the context is, I'm not sure. It will be really nice if he can make a little bit clear the question, but it seems like he's asking, nowadays, are you feeling this difference in your body, this quantic change coming to all of us, emanating different frequencies?
Are you speaking, like asking me personally, or in general after Descent to Soul or something like that? You can either like make yourself, I don't know if you can unmute yourself or not, but you could at least say in the chat.
Sí, Luis Alejandro, ¿podrías un poco dar un poquito más de contexto en tu pregunta? Es una pregunta que le haces personal a Nate sobre este momento. Pues por favor darle más contexto para que él te pueda responder.
Hola, hola.
Hola,
Feliz noche. Buena
Te
energía. Sí, es que como los campos energéticos han cambiado, y escuchando pues al maestro hablar, quisiera preguntarle si él siente ese cambio energético en sus cuerpos. Eso es lo que quiero preguntar. Gracias.
Gracias. Okay. Yes, Nate, it's a personal question. How do you feel this environment nowadays that the energy is changing? This is a personal question. So I will repeat it again. Can you feel the difference in your body? Can you feel the quantic change? Do your systems emanate a different frequency?
I would say that I feel very much like a different person than I did 10, 20 years ago. I think even yesterday I would make that argument, but it's really obvious when I consider 20 years ago. And I would say that maybe it's been reflected here in what I've been saying the last 2 hours. I don't just carry with me my own personal version of a sense of magic and wonder in the world, and I just always long to feel that even more. It's like the most wonderful drug that there's no problem with having more and more of it. Wonder and mystery and magic in the world. But that's not all I carry with me, my own version of that, but also just a tremendous amount of heartbreak and grief. And I consider that just as important as the wonder and the magic and the mystery. And I actually consider them to be not really very different at all. Because that which I grieve for is that which is intimately related to that which I find so magical and mysterious and wonderful. And I would say, yeah, I do feel that in my body. I don't feel like some kind of superhero or, like some kind of magical priest or anything. I just feel like a human. I think it's the birthright that we all have, and don't even want to pretend like I'm fully living out the deepest possibility of the human species by any means. But like I've got a sense of it. I've got enough of a sense of it in my own life to want to share it with you all, and I know that many of you all have your own experiences, and maybe even right in this moment feeling your own versions of something like magic, mystery, wonder, and also grief and heartbreak. But yeah, I feel it in my body for sure, and in my emotional body, and how I perceive the world. I think something that I'm probably in hindsight will wish that I had talked more about is the art of perception and how we perceive. And maybe wish I had said more about childhood and eco-soul-centric childhood and what that looks like. And Paul Shepard, who I mentioned earlier, another beautiful thing he said is that childhood is the training grounds for perception. Childhood is the training grounds for perception. Yeah, I think the embodied, deeply psychological, deeply like of the psyche, psychospiritual even, but embodied relationship with the world in which we perceive that magic. We don't just imagine it, but we perceive it with, like, for example, with the bird song in the morning. I hear with my own ears, and it does something to me. There's a kind of magic in that. And sometimes I'm oblivious to it, and sometimes it just shakes me to the core. And there's countless examples of that, because the world is full of countless opportunities to feel its magic and its mystery. But the grief also, just emphasize that one more time. The grief is the other thing you can follow besides your longing. Sometimes I kind of try to distill some of this. It's my own version of Joseph Campbell's "Follow Your Bliss." I say, if you're gonna there's anything I can offer you, it's follow your longing and your grief. They're two sides of the same coin. They sleep in the same bed. They're twins. Follow your grief, follow your longing. And I would say in your question, yes, they both live in my body, and I feel them as fully as I can every day. And both. Don't try to run away from the grief. The grief will break your heart open. And if your heart gets broken open, then you have an open heart. You're more available to the world.
Thank you, Nate. There is a last question, even though we have already surpassed the time we had. If you answer it, we can open a little bit of a space for it. It comes from Adriana Hurtado, and she says, somehow direct activism is led by the ego and seems contradictory to becoming available for the next thing to happen, to open up to those beautiful and magical mysteries of the world. How not to mislead following those threads by the engagement with the fixed ideas and credos involved in direct activism, even though for things you truly believe are right for the whole.
I'm also reading the question so that I can get a better sense of it also, in addition to hearing it from you.
This is going to be our last question because we have to close after that, but thank you for taking time for this one.
Maybe this is a good opportunity to just kind of end on that notion of, just to take us kind of back to the beginning. What do we mean by soul-centric, and what is soul? Just to like this example of the ego itself is not bad. At least in my definition of the ego, by which I just mean the I, and the consciousness that recognizes that there is an I in the world. There's an I as a part of the world, but there's a difference between having an ego, having a conscious self-awareness, and being egocentric. So the ego is always at play. We can't get rid of our egos. We wouldn't want to. This definition of ego, we wouldn't want to get rid of them. That we would lose our psychological coherence. But we also, we wouldn't want to. We can't get rid of the ego. The ego itself is neither bad nor good. It just is what it is. But being egocentric, where the something that's kind of like self-serving rather than in service to the whole, to just draw this final distinction is that after the descent to soul, after becoming conscious of our soul in the world, the ego is refashioned. It's kind of it doesn't go away, but it changes, and the primary way it changes is that it discovers how to be in service to soul, which is to say, in service to the world, rather than in service to itself. And some, in this like hall of mirrors, not even really knowing what actually serves the self, because we have such a limited view of ourselves and of the world. That's what it means to be egocentric, to have an extremely small making understanding or view of what the self is. But a soul-centric ego, an ego that serves the soul, so an ego that's rooted in soul, understands the self to be much larger than the individual, or at least the self in relationship to a larger whole, in which it's embedded, and within which it's in profound, mysterious relationship. And so maybe it doesn't feel like I'm speaking directly to your question, but I think I am. Just to say that direct activism in and of itself may be neither good nor bad. I'm sure there's lots of people engaged in direct activism that are doing it from an egocentric place. And I'm sure there is direct activism being done from a soul-centric place, from even a soul-conscious place. Right? So that's one of the ways that someone who's conscious of their soul place in the world would be one of the ways that they can embody their soul in the world. It's, by stopping that forest, or doing everything they can to stopping that particular forest from being cut down, because there's something about their soul life that's deeply in primary relationship with that forest. And so they would do everything they can to keep it from being cut down, including potentially even like tying their own body up to one of the trees or something like that. So yeah, I would say that direct activism in and of itself, it could go either way, but that question of what is the ego in service to? And that's probably the primary question for anything, not just direct activism, but for anything that we do.
Thank you, Nate. It is really enlightening. And it's been a pleasure talking to you tonight, and everybody. Thank you for being with us and for your questions, your time, your open mind and spirit, and the willing to listen to these ways of inhabiting this world in a different way, rooted in our souls. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nate.
Thank you, Aleja. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Denise, for translating.
Sí, muchas gracias a todo acá el equipo de Efecto Mariposa, and thank you so much, Nate. It was really, really inspiring.
Thank you all for being here, and I hope to be able to have tea or coffee with all of you someday and hear your voices and see all of your faces. That would feel good to me. But thank you for joining me and letting me have a chance to speak. I appreciate it. Many blessings to all of you.
We will be having you here, of course, in this Colombian territory for you to deliver all this knowledge and all those inspiring ideas.
Yeah, I'm excited to actually get to come back in person. That will be a welcome.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, everybody. So have a good night. And again, thank you for all your time and the willing of participating in this world.
Buenas noches, hasta luego. Un placer haber compartido este espacio con todos.